Please welcome to the stage, Braxton Thornley.
Thanks so much, and thanks for being here this afternoon. I'm really excited to talk to all of you today. As you can see, our session is titled A House Called Tomorrow, Authentic Engagement and Belonging. So hopefully you're here to learn a little bit and consider some ideas about how we can make schools feel like joyous, wonderful places where students are excited to be, they're excited to show up, and they're excited to engage in their learning in those spaces. That's kind of what we're getting at. Now, the very first thing I want to address is I want to give you a little bit of information about me so that you know who is speaking to you today. So first off, my name is Braxton Thornley. I work for the Utah Education Network, and in my role, I get to travel to schools and districts all over the state and work with teachers and administrators and district leaders in a variety of contexts. And in all of those contexts, I get to see the amazing things happening in schools, and I also get to see some of the challenges that these schools are encountering. And when going to these schools and hearing about the challenges they're facing, I've been struck with this big idea that I've been chewing on a little bit. And it's how can we make our schools joyful places where students want to be? That's kind of the root of what we're going to be getting at today. How can we make those joyful places? And so as I've been chewing on this question, I've done quite a bit of research. And as you can see from some of my credentials or some of my experience that's listed here, I have the opportunity right now to be working through a graduate program at the University of Utah. And so as I work through that program, one of the key questions that I keep coming back to in all of my work is the question that I pose to you. And that's what I'm hoping to at least kind of address today and give you some ideas to think about and take back to your own schools to hopefully increase some of the joy that you feel in that building and in that site. Now, we're going to do a couple of things today, and I wanted to give you an idea of where we're headed. As you can see here, we're going to start by actually reading a poem. I can't help myself. I'm a former language arts teacher, and so I have to share this poem with you. It's one of my favorites, and it's what the session is based on. You can see that I've pulled my title from the title of the poem, and we'll look at that in just a moment. After we look at that poem, though, and after we kind of frame the session a little bit more, I want to speak to some of the challenges that schools are facing right now, some of the challenges that you may be facing right now. But I want to frame those as opportunities for us to reinvent some of the dynamics that are present inside of our schools. And so we'll talk about challenges, but we'll talk about challenges in such a way to lead into these opportunities that we have to reinvent our classrooms and reinvent our schools as places where students feel seen, they feel heard, and they feel excited to be. After we do that, we're going to talk a little bit about engagement. And I have a couple of engagement frameworks that I want to show you today that have really shaped how I've thought about student engagement. And then finally, we're going to get to kind of the meat and the crux of the presentation when we start talking about how do we apply these ideas about engagement? What does that look like in our classrooms? What are some tools that we can use to hopefully boost students' engagement and their sense of belonging in our schools and in our classrooms? Now, with all of that said, like I mentioned before, I do want to begin with a poem. And you can access that poem on the QR code if you want. I'm also going to read it to you. I've pulled the key lines from the poem for this slide that you can see here. But I think it's important that you hear the whole thing. I find it an incredibly inspiring and empowering poem, and it's one that I often shared with my students in my classroom. So I hope you'll enjoy it. It's A House Called Tomorrow. It's by Alberto Ríos. You are not 15 or 12 or 17. You are 100 wild centuries in 15, bringing with you in every breath and in every step everyone who has come before you, all the yous that you have been, the mothers of your mother, the fathers of your father. If someone in your family tree was trouble, 100 were not. The bad do not win, not finally, no matter how loud they are. We simply would not be here if that were so. You are made fundamentally from the good. With this knowledge, you never march alone. You are the breaking news of the century. You are the good who has come forward through it all, even if so many days feel otherwise. But think, when you as a child learned to speak, it's not that you didn't know words. It's that from the centuries you knew so many, and it's hard to choose the words that will be your own. From those centuries, we human beings bring with us the simple solutions and songs, the river bridges and star charts and song harmonies, all in service to a simple idea: that you can make a house called tomorrow. What we bring finally into the new day every day is ourselves, and that's all we need to start. That's everything we require to keep going. Look back only for as long as you must, then go forward into the history you will make. Be good, then better. Write books, cure disease, make us proud, make yourself proud, and those who came before you. When you hear thunder, hear it as their applause. And so I would always share this poem with my students, and I would have them think, and I'd have them talk, and I'd have them kind of digest this idea of who are all of the people who have come before you, who have built who you are. But then also, we would pivot to that question that I want to pose to you today. And the question is this: Alberto Ríos argues that we can build a house called tomorrow. We can build the future. And this is what's so empowering to me about this poem. And so I want to pose that question to you: is what is your house of tomorrow going to be? What do you want your classroom to be? What do you want your school to be? What do you want your district to be? What do you want your community to be? And I think when we started that question, what do we want this space to be, we can arrive at some really interesting answers. Now, with that said, we also have to navigate complex challenges that we are facing in all of our schools. And like I mentioned before, there are very real, potent challenges that teachers all over the state are dealing with. I'm going to present you with a couple, but I also want to create space for the idea that everyone in their own context is going to arrive with their own challenges. You may resonate with some of these may be new to you. The first is this: over the last few years, we've seen attendance become an issue in a lot of schools. Now, I want to add an important caveat. I recently saw this year's numbers are trending in the right direction. Some of these issues are starting to be addressed because schools and teachers and school leaders are doing incredibly impactful work. But the problem still kind of remains. As you can see here, chronic absenteeism has exploded across Utah. Heading into the pandemic, in the school year right before COVID-19 broke out, we had a chronic absenteeism rate of about 9%. You can see that in the last year, that number was approximately 24%. And we feel that in our classrooms. And we feel that in our classrooms in a couple of ways. The first way that we feel that is that as a teacher, if you are working with students who are chronically absent, you know that it's challenging to get them caught up, but it's also challenging to build a community where your students are sometimes here and sometimes not here. And that's been a big challenge for a lot of schools throughout the state. But additionally, even when that isn't a challenge, even when you feel pretty good about that, there are also other lingering effects of the pandemic and just new things that we run into with students as students continue to change. A recent study found that 69.5% of high school students reported feeling, I misstated that. 69.5% of the time, high school students report feeling bored at school. So if you take a high school student, what they're telling us is that for roughly 70% of their school day, they feel bored. They feel bored. And in that same study, they asked high school students, what are 3 emotions that you feel most when you are at school? And these were the 3 most common words that they got from those students: tired, bored, and stressed. Now, this isn't to say that we've gone completely off the rails. There are fantastic things happening in our schools, but I know that teachers feel this pressure. Something is different in our kids. Something's changing a little bit. Something isn't the way it used to be. And I'm really interested in investigating what we can do to address some of these data points that we're seeing and that we're seeing in our classrooms as we engage with students. So this brings us to the part where I want to speak to some of the engagement frameworks that I mentioned before, some of the ways that I've started to think of engagement in new and different ways. The first is by viewing engagement in multiple dimensions. And as you can see, really small along the bottom, I've taken these dimensions from the work of Fredericks, Bloomfield, and Paris. And I have a reference list at the end that you can check out all these sources if you're interested. But the key idea here is that engagement plays in three main areas. And speaking from my own experience as a teacher and as an instructional coach, a lot of time I spent most of my energy focusing on that top domain, behavioral engagement, right? This is easy to track, it's easy to see. Do students follow the rules? Do they do the thing that I tell them to do? That's easy. And we pay attention to that because it's easy to analyze and mark. The other ones are a little bit trickier to identify in our students though, and I'm going to argue that they are even more critical. So you can see that one of the domains of engagement is also the idea of cognitive engagement. Are our students struggling with complex ideas? Are they chewing on things that are really impactful and meaningful to them? And then down at the bottom is the one that I worry we neglect the most, or at least I did as a teacher. And it's the idea of emotional engagement. And for me, that has become more and more critical as I work with more and more teachers. Is yes, your student may be following your directions, they may be turning in the assignment, whatever the case may be, but did they have an emotional experience in your classroom? Did they feel something while they were there? Because one of the interesting things that we're starting to see in the research on student joy and engagement and how to make schools engaging, beautiful places is that students have to feel something. They have to feel something. And so as I've started working with more and more teachers, I try to integrate that little piece of information into our conversations. What is your objective today? What are you teaching? How are you going to arrive at that place? But also, what are your students going to feel during your lesson? Are they going to laugh? Are they going to feel sad? Are they going to feel angry about something? And that can be so critical in making students, first off, feel connected to their peers, but also feel like what they're learning really matters to them. Now, additionally, Amy Berry wrote some really interesting ideas on engagement recently. You can see that her study came out in 2020, and in that study, she points to a continuum of engagement. And this is something that we see in students, and you probably recognize this thinking about your own students. But engagement is not a yes or no question, right? We have varying degrees of engagement. And so what Amy Berry hypothesized and what she's arguing is that engagement essentially falls into 6 categories. And you can see those range from disrupting to driving, but that's really started to shift how I think about classrooms as well. Because as an early teacher, in some of my first years, when I was trying to engage my students, I would maybe bring in a game or bring in an exciting activity, and I think we should continue doing those things. Those are great things. But the question that I didn't ask enough is how can I empower my students so that they are driving the learning, right? I often played in this participating and investing range, which is still a great range to be in, right? And we love when our students are participating and we love when our students are investing in their learning. But the piece that I was missing was how do we get students to drive their learning? How do we make it so that they are in control of where they're headed and they really believe in what they're headed? And so as I've been researching more and more on engagement and trying to think of how we take classrooms and make them really exciting, innovative, joyful places for children, these ideas have come to me. First off, going back a second, we need to attune to the emotional tenor of our classrooms. What is the emotion that's in there? And specifically, what emotions can we drive inside of there so that students leave our rooms having had an impactful experience? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is the one that I posed just a moment ago. How do we get students to drive their learning and move their learning forward of their own accord? And these are big questions, and I am not going to tell you that I have answers. If I did have the silver bullet to these questions, I would be very wealthy, and I would be traveling all over the country. I don't have concrete answers, but I do have some suggestions, and I do have some ideas that I've seen come up over and over and over again in the research, and those are the suggestions I want to give to you. There are 5 of them. Some of them are going to seem familiar. Some of them are going to seem a little trite. I promise, though, that I'm going to drill down into these and give you some more specifics. As you can see, there are 5 main things that we're going to touch on today. One of them is, how do we foster positive relationships? And this is always a conversation that happens in schools, especially during and after the pandemic. This has been a big conversation. But I think the piece that's been missing from the conversation is, what do students need in order to feel like they have a positive relationship? Oftentimes, when I've heard people speak about positive relationships, that conversation has kind of ended with the suggestion to build positive relationship. Like, go make sure that you have a good relationship with your students. Do that and you should be set. And I think that's kind of true to some extent, but I think it's also useful to break those relationships into smaller parts and talk about how we can actually facilitate those. So we'll address that today. There is also a dire need to make sure that we are providing students with optimal challenge. Are they challenged in our classroom? So we'll talk a little bit about that. Additionally, though, the research is fairly clear that the more autonomy that we can provide to students, the more they are going to feel like their learning matters and the more they're going to engage in that learning. Additionally, you can see that it's important to leverage mastery-oriented goals. And then finally, demonstrating enthusiasm comes up over and over again in the research on engagement. And that means teachers need to be enthusiastic. And that is something that I've been chewing on quite a bit. Because as a teacher, I was enthusiastic, and I know many teachers are enthusiastic. But also, I feel like there are some really important concrete ideas that we need to address within enthusiasm, because enthusiasm doesn't just mean like walking onto stage in front of your classroom and jumping up and down and talking in a really excited voice, right? What enthusiasm really means is that when students interact with me after our conversation, after we've talked, or after I've given them feedback, or after I've asked them questions, they should leave that interaction believing deeply in my belief in learning. After students are done talking to me, do they know that Mr. Thornley believes in the process of education? Do they know that Mr. Thornley believes in the value of learning for learning's sake? And that's what I think we really need to drill down to. So when I say enthusiasm, I do sort of mean your content area or your grade level or the thing that you're teaching in front of the classroom. Enthusiasm is still really important there. But what I also mean, and what I want to focus on today, is the idea of enthusiasm for learning and the learning process. And so with that in mind, I want to kind of speak to some of these recommendations and how they might play out in the classroom and how we can start building them into our schools to hopefully build a house called tomorrow that we are all proud to work and build towards. So let's talk about relationships first. When we talk about building positive relationships, there are a lot of things that students need in order for a positive relationship to happen. Now, this model that you see behind me is a model that was developed by David Rock and Christine Cox. And the model is called the SCARF model. And it's an acronym, but it essentially outlines things that need to be in place in order for students to feel connected to their peers and connected to their teacher. And so you can think of this both ways. What do students need when they're interacting with the kid next to them? But what do they need when they're interacting with you? So you can see that the first element in here is status. And status for me is kind of a loaded word. There's a lot of connotations attached to status. But within the research, what's being referred to as status is simply that when I interact with you, I need to feel that I am important in some way. That's the first thing students need. So I want you to take a second and consider some of the ways that you help students feel important in your classroom. I'm sure you do a lot of things already. Mull that over a little bit. And I also want you to consider what are some of the things that you or your school does to make students feel important inside of that school context. What sort of things are happening there? How can we make sure that students feel important? Now, to clarify, students do not need to feel like they are the king of the world. That is not what this is saying. They do not need to be little dictators that run the entire building. But they do need to sense that they are going to be missed if they are not there, and that their voice is heard, and that they matter inside of their context. The next thing that you can see in this model is certainty. This is really, really important for kids, especially kids who have experienced some form of trauma. Certainty is that students should be able to approach interpersonal relationships with some degree of predictability on how that interaction is going to go. Again, this applies to student relationships, and this applies to teacher and student relationships. And this is something that I think we are really pretty strong in most schools because we have developed such strong systems and routines and procedures. But that's something important to consider as well, is when students interact with you, is there some degree of predictability how that interaction is going to go? And of course, we don't want our interactions to be dull or anything like that, but students should know that if I go to my teacher with this type of concern, this is what I can expect to happen. Or if I go to my peer and I say this type of thing, this is what I can expect will happen. And that certainty is really important for kids. The next one on the line is autonomy, and we talked briefly about autonomy a moment ago, and we'll talk more about it in just a moment. But autonomy is important for people to feel like they're in a valuable relationship. And as far as relationships go with autonomy, students need to feel as if they have some control over what's happening inside of the relationship. Some is an operative word here. They do not need all of the control, but they do need to feel as if they can bring up suggestions, recommend things, and those suggestions will be taken into account. The next is relatedness. And it's interesting because relatedness to me has always seemed like an idea of how much do I feel connected to my peer. And it is that. But the piece that I was missing before doing all of this research was that students also need to feel safe around the people that they are with. And by safe, we of course mean physically safe, but mostly we mean emotionally safe. In other words, can students show up to your classroom, or can they show up to the group that they are working in, and in that group feel like they can be their true selves? Do they have to put on a show for people? If they have to put on a show for people, in that instance, they are not fully safe in that environment. They're not emotionally safe in that environment. And therefore, that's one of the things that we need to target. So as we're thinking about what it looks like to build relationships, it's also really important as a school and as a PLC team to talk about this idea of, do our students have the freedom to show up as who they are in our classrooms? Do they have to put on a show for us? Do they have to put on a show for their peers? This is a key question. The last one is that in positive, productive relationships, people expect to be treated with some degree of fairness, and we can all assume this, right? And students need to see that fairness demonstrated. So they need to see that the teacher is going to respond to them in the same way that they respond to peers, and that the principal is going to respond to them in the same way that they respond to their peers. And that element is really, really key. So to circle back to this recommendation that I mentioned before of fostering positive relationships, we do need to do that. But I think that the way that we get there is by identifying some of the ideas that we see here. Do our students feel important? Do they have some sort of predictability on how our interactions with them are going to go? Do they have some sense of control over some of the events in this relationship or some of the interactions in this relationship? Additionally, can they be their authentic selves with their peers and with us? And then finally, are we treating everyone equally? And are we making sure that we are fair in all of our interactions? These are the key questions that get us to a point where we can start actually working on our relationships mending relationships when needed, and building new and more productive relationships with students. And so as I work with teachers and as I work with teams of teachers, one of the things that I have people do is that I recommend that they take this model and they think about each component individually and identify a component where you feel like you might be the weakest or where you feel like your school might be the weakest, and then also identify where you feel like you're the strongest. And of course, you can see where this is headed, but we want to target the specific skill inside of there that's going to help us build positive relationships, because it's not enough to simply say, you know what, I'm gonna stand in the hallway and I'm gonna say hi to as many kids as I can. We should do that, that's great. But a lot of our students are showing up in our classrooms in our school with really complex needs. And the way that we address those needs is by building relationships, and we do that by targeting the needs that they have inside of those interpersonal relationships. Now, going back for another moment, you can see that the second recommendation here was that in order for students to be engaged, we need to provide them with optimal challenge. This is incredibly difficult. You have students in your classroom who are probably excelling, blowing past all of your expectations. They're just generally outstanding in everything they produce. But I'm also confident that you probably have students in your classroom who are really, really struggling and have been struggling for a long time, and maybe view school as a place where they struggle and they don't succeed and there's no reason to try because they've been taught over and over and over again that it's going to be a losing game for them. And you have both of those students in the same classroom. And you have a limited amount of time. Maybe you have 60 minutes, maybe you have 90 minutes, maybe you have an hour and a half block of language arts that you do in the morning with your kids. Whatever the case may be, you have a limited amount of time to reach all of these kids in their different places, and that's challenging. But one of the things that has been helpful to me as I think about how we provide optimal challenge is actually to return back to Amy Berry's continuum of engagement and layer it on top of Bloom's taxonomy, which is what you're seeing here. So across the bottom of this chart or graph, you can see that we just have the descriptors from Bloom's taxonomy. So this is essentially kind of like the cognitive rigor of any task that you are giving a student, right? Am I asking them to remember something? Am I asking them to understand something? Am I asking them to apply something, analyze, evaluate, create, so on and so forth? That's how challenging the thing is. But then along the side in the green, you can see that we've layered on Amy Berry's continuum of engagement. So in this task or activity, are students being disruptive? Are they avoiding the task? Are they withdrawing from the task? Are they participating? Are they investing? Or hopefully they're driving, right? And so what I've been looking at a lot with teachers is rather than going into a classroom and tracking how many kids have their heads down on desk, how many kids answer questions, all of that's still good and valuable data. But I also think it's interesting to interrogate some of the tasks that are happening inside of that classroom. And I want to give you an example of this. These examples come from my own classroom. So one of the things that I would frequently do in my classroom is I would have students play like some sort of a Kahoot or quizzes game. And you've probably done this as well with your students. And I would typically do this with like vocabulary words or just terms that I wanted students to know. And with those games, they'd all log in and they'd earn points by like answering multiple choice questions correctly. Those are still valuable learning experiences. And I think we should continue to do those things. However, one of the things that's become more and more interesting for me is as I think back on those types of activities, and I look at this framework, I'm realizing that within the context of my students' engagement, I may not have been challenging them enough to get them to a point where they could drive the instruction. Or I might not have been putting them in a position where they could drive the instruction. So for instance, in that type of a game, my students are mostly just remembering and understanding terms, right? And they may be participating in that, and they might even be investing in that, but that's not the type of scenario where they can really drive where their learning is taking them, right? And so as I started maturing as a teacher and as I gained more experience and as I worked with a number of phenomenal instructional coaches, one of the things that I realized that needed to change about my own classroom was that it wasn't enough to have like a really exciting activity once a week or even once a day. That wasn't enough because I wasn't getting the right type of engagement from my students. I was getting almost sort of like a fleeting type of engagement in that my students would be excited for the 20-minute game, they'd be invested in the 20-minute game, and then after that, they'd go back to this place of not being engaged, and they'd just reset. And the more I've read and the more I've worked with other people who know more about this than I do, the more I've realized that the reason that students kind of went back and reset and stopped engaging once that was over is because I wasn't putting them in the driver's seat enough. And you can see that in this graphic, essentially what's being communicated here is that in order for students to really take control of their learning and really be invested in their learning and be engaged over the long term rather than in the short term, we need to be able to push them to some of those deeper cognitive levels. We need to ask them to critically evaluate things. We need to ask them to create things. We need to ask them to build things and ask big questions, right? And once students begin doing those types of things, we can then empower them to start driving their own learning. Now I want to give you another example. Another example from my classroom is my first year teaching, I asked my students to write persuasive letters. I was a language arts teacher, by the way. And so as part of our language arts curriculum, students needed to be able to write persuasively. And so I decided, you know what, it would be really good if my students wrote letters to someone in which they were trying to persuade them. And that works pretty well, and it was nice, and it was good. And then the next year, I did that again, except I kind of built on it. And I said, you know what, this year, we're still gonna write the letters, except I'm going to buy a bunch of stamps and envelopes, and we're gonna actually mail the letters to people. And I told my students this, and they were horrified. This was the worst news they had ever received. They're like, I do not want to actually send my letter. But I said, you know what? In this classroom, we're gonna actually do the thing that we're learning to do. And so I'm going to ask that you send your letter. And of course, we went through an in-depth revision process and all of those things, but they actually mailed their letters. And I noticed something changed. First off, my students were held more accountable, but also they were a lot more invested in their topics because they felt like it was actually real, right? And so then as a teacher, I was like, oh, I'm on to something. This is beautiful. Let's see how far we can push this. And then the next year, we did something similar, except now students are proposing projects to me. And their projects are going a little bit deeper than just persuading people, because now I'm asking them to also lay out timelines and proposals and budgets for people. So more than just this is a good idea, students are now asked to say, this is a good idea, here's how you are going to implement it. And the reason I share this example is because it points to this idea of trying to get students to direct more and more of their learning. Now, rather than like a one-week project in which students sat down and wrote a letter and then we called it good, I'm now asking students to engage in a really in-depth project that's going to take them a lot of time. And because I'm doing that, I'm now giving them the opportunity to kind of dictate the topic and the mode of study for an entire unit. And so what that looks like in my classroom now is students are, of course, still writing. We're still doing that. They're still peer reviewing. But depending on what people's projects are, they're going to need different things. And so I have a list of all of my students' projects, and I'm running mini lessons in a corner of my classroom with maybe like 5 kids while other kids are writing, other kids are researching. And the idea that I'm trying to get at here is the more that we can provide students with opportunities to say, this is where I want to go, and this is how I'm going to get there, the more they're going to experience some of that lasting engagement that lingers beyond an individual activity. The next thing on our recommendation list, though, is this idea of student autonomy. And we've spoken about that, and we've said, you know what, it's really important to give students some of these choices where they can say, this is where I want to go next, this is where I'm headed, this is what I feel passionate about. But it also gets tricky to really define what autonomy looks like in a classroom. And this is where I found that Maker and Shiver, I don't know how to pronounce it, how their framework of autonomy is really, really helpful in my thinking of how we give students more option in the classroom. And the two of them propose that there are 4 main ways to provide autonomy to students. The first is that we can provide students choice in content. What this sounds like is you choose the topic for your essay. You decide what you want to research or explore. Or in a different content area, it might sound like, okay guys, we have one station that's going to talk about the Revolutionary War, one station that's going to talk about the Civil War, and one station that's going to talk about maybe like the Korean War. You choose which station you want to go to. That's a choice in content, right? But another way to provide students with autonomy is to provide them some choice in process. And this is one of the things that I stumbled upon accidentally when I started having my students write and send proposals to people. Because as I was asking them to come up with topics, and as I was asking them to come up with what they wanted to propose and pitch, I also asked them to outline how they were going to move through that process. And I asked them to set their own due dates. And I asked them to tell me when they were going to peer review. And I asked them to tell me when they wanted my feedback. And I asked them to tell me when they were going to conduct their research, and all of those things. And I said, here are all of the parts that you need inside of this project. You have to do 3 peer reviews. You have to do 2 reviews with me. You have to do X, Y, and Z, all of these things. You decide when those things are going to happen. That type of dynamic is going to be a choice in process. And that's one of the key things that we could give to students to help boost some of that engagement, because now they are achieving a little bit more autonomy over how they're going about things inside of your room. Next on the list you can see is choice and representation. This simply means students get to choose how they demonstrate their learning to you. So rather than saying, you know what, for this assignment, I'm going to ask you to write a paragraph explaining X, Y, and Z concepts, choice and representation looks like, for this assignment, you can either write about this, you can record a video about this, you can make up an acronym that defines this and explains this, so on and so forth. Providing students opportunities to show their learning in different ways is a choice in representation, and that's one of the 4 main ways that we can boost autonomy in our classrooms. The last one is choice in environment, and this one is always the trickiest, right? Because we have limited space, and also classroom management is always going to be a consideration. And so we can think, though, along the lines of what does our space look like? And can we provide some flexibility inside of that space? This might be something like allowing students to choose for a certain amount of time, whether they're sitting in the back of the room or the front of the room. This might be like students get to choose what type of chair they're sitting on. It's really going to depend on what your environment looks like, but that's another layer of autonomy that we can provide to students. Now, the authors here propose that the more levels of autonomy that we can build into a thing, the more students are going to be engaged inside of it. And so what that means for us is that most teachers typically have 1 or 2 pieces of autonomy inside of a given lesson or inside of a given project or activity. And so the question becomes, can I layer in 1 more? Can I do one more of those things? Because the more we can layer on top of each other, the more students are going to feel empowered in their learning. The next recommendation on the list is mastery-oriented goals. And mastery-oriented goals are really interesting because it looks like almost a reframing of how we grade students or how we assess students. And one of the key things that's come up in a lot of research is that the more we can emphasize mastery over time, regardless of what your process looks like, the more students are going to be motivated to continue learning. So you can see there are a couple of examples here from classrooms, and I'm going to give you a minute or 2 to read those, and then I'll speak to them a bit more. Now, this kind of wades into tricky territory, right? Because you might not be in control of how your school does grading. You probably aren't. But one of the things that the research points to over and over again is the more that we can emphasize growth to our students, the more they are going to succeed and be motivated. Now, in these scenarios, growth is demonstrated by a grade. But growth does not always have to be shown to students in that way. In other words, if you are constrained in how your grading looks in your building, which again, you probably are, if your grading has to look like X, Y, and Z, there are still a number of opportunities where you have the chance to emphasize growth to students. And you could show students, in this context, I saw that you started here, and now you've moved to here. And I saw that you started here, and now you've moved to here. And all of those dynamics can be really empowering for students in continuing to boost their engagement over the long term, and ensuring that they see value in their learning and value in what they're doing inside of their classroom. The last recommendation on the list is the one that I really want to land on and spend the most time with. Because over and over again in the research, the idea of enthusiasm comes up. And I talked to you before about what enthusiasm means and what it doesn't mean and what it could mean. And it means a lot of things. It means being enthusiastic about what you're teaching, but it also means being enthusiastic about the process of learning. And this is something that I love working with teachers on. Because students need to know every single day that what they are learning in that classroom is going to have value to them. That's tricky to accomplish, but we have a couple of avenues of getting there. The first avenue is that we always want to provide relevance for our learning. That's something that you all know and you probably already do in your classrooms. You are most likely taking ideas from your content area and connecting them to people's lives and connecting them to your students' experiences and describing how your content relates to those. That's critical. But then learning with immediacy is one that I think that we need to do more of in our schools. Because learning with immediacy means that when students are in our classrooms, they should know that when they leave, they're going to leave with something valuable to them right then. And I like to tell my students, when I was working with students in my classroom, I used to tell them, we are going to learn X, Y, and Z today. Here's how you're going to know that you achieved that. And here is how that is going to make you a better person today. And that today piece is so critical for kids. Because we often tell kids things like, you need to learn this because later on you might need to use this in X, Y, and Z situations, right? Or you need to learn this because it's going to be really useful to you when you get to college. And those things are true, and we should continue saying them. There's nothing wrong with those things. But we also know from a lot of brain research that children and teenagers really struggle with long-term decision-making and long-term thought processes. And so what that means is if I'm a student and I'm sitting in, let's say, my 8th grade English class, and my teacher says something like, when you are an adult, you're going to have to do blah, 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 blah. That's probably true. However, if I'm an 8th grade student, I am going to have a hard time making that tangible. And because I'm going to have a hard time making that tangible, I'm going to have a hard time making it motivating. And so what I always recommend to people is that we need to find ways to make things matter to our students right here and right now. I'm going to give you another example. My students were typically juniors in high school, which meant that they cared deeply about things like prom. That mattered a lot to them. And so we would oftentimes frame things around these events that are happening in their lives right then. I read a poem to you today as we started our session. I also started my class that way, by reading poems. And typically, I would get questions that were like, why do we read poems? Why do we care about poems? And I have a lot of answers to that question, actually. But one of the answers to that question was because people care about other people who care about things. And poetry is one of the ways that we demonstrate care, that we're passionate about something. And I would tell my students that there are going to be moments in your life where simple words are not enough. And I'd provide them some examples, right? And I'd say something like, when I proposed to my wife, I quoted a line from poetry because simple words weren't enough. When my friend died, I turned to poetry because simple words were not enough, right? And you might have something in your life right now. You probably have something in your life right now where simple words are not enough. Consider that thing. What is happening right now in your life? And I want you to think about it. And that's why we talked about poetry, right? But the key element there isn't poetry, and poetry is wonderful. But the key element is that everything we do needs to touch back to this idea of what's happening in your life right now. And how is what we're talking about right now going to make you a better person when you leave this room today, whenever that is? Next down, you can see that we need learning environments that are mediated by connection. Our students should be interacting with each other all the time. They should be interacting with us all the time, because the more that they connect with one another, the more they feel like they are powerful and involved in something critical and learning something in a group. And there's so much value in being part of a group that's working towards something. The next item is, it's important to frame learning for our students as a means of empowerment. How is this learning going to empower you as a human being? And we kind of spoke to this a little bit with this idea of learning with immediacy. How are you going to leave this room a better person, but also how are you going to leave this room a more empowered person? Someone who can accomplish things, someone who can change things, someone who can build their own house of tomorrow. How are you going to take what you have here and apply it? And then the last one, and this is the one that I really try to land on with students, especially now in the current environment of different technologies like artificial intelligence and different situations where students are like being pulled in different directions of, oh, we learn so we can get a good job, and yes, we do that, and oh, we learn so that we can go to college, and yes, we do that, but also we learn because learning is essentially a human endeavor, and we are human beings, and part of what it means to be a human being is to learn. And we don't do it because we have to do it. We do it because human beings are innately curious. And sometimes we have the curiosity beaten out of us by society. But that doesn't mean that it's gone forever. And what I would always try to argue with my students is that the degree to which you can be curious is first off the degree that you can be successful, but more importantly, the degree to which you are curious is also the degree to which you are going to feel as if you are leading a meaningful, interesting, vibrant life. Because questions are what drive us as human beings. And so I always would try to frame my content in my class in this idea of, we're going to move away from you need to learn this so that you can accomplish this down the road, to a place where it feels like you're going to learn this because learning is a beautiful thing. And that's what we do as human beings. Now, that's a hard sell for a lot of teenagers, and it's a hard sell for a lot of kids. But I'm going to argue that it's okay if students don't internalize that while they are in our classrooms. But I'm also going to argue that it's critical that they hear that message, that learning is a part of what we do as human beings, and learning is a part of who we are. Now, with all of that said, we've talked about a couple of things today, and I'm going to jump back in the slides just so we can get back to this list. Our students who are coming to us oftentimes feeling a little bit disenchanted, or sometimes they don't feel disenchanted, but they've been through such a rocky road that they feel disconnected from their school, even if they want to be connected with their school, right? And while I don't have a magic wand to offer you, I am going to propose that some of the things that we do in our classrooms and our buildings can address some of these issues. So we can foster positive relationships by thinking about all the dynamics that students need inside of those relationships. Do they feel important? Can they predict how those relationships will go? Do they feel heard? Do they feel safe to be themselves? Do they feel like they are treated fairly? Additionally, we also need to think about ways that our students can not only be engaged, but drive their learning so that they can be engaged over the long term. It's relatively easy to engage students for 10 or 15 minutes, and you all know that because you've been in rooms with students. The goal, though, is to engage students across weeks. And the way that we do that is by providing them with a little bit of autonomy and choice. And that autonomy and choice looks like a few different things, but these 4 things are where I always start. Do students have the capacity to choose some of their content? Maybe not all of it, but do they have the choice to choose some of it? Do they have a choice in the process of learning that or demonstrating that? Do they have choice in how they are showing that to you? And then finally, do they have any sort of choice inside of their environment in how they are learning that? Next, we need to emphasize the importance of growth. We need to show our students that they are growing, and we need to demonstrate that to them as often as we can. And finally, most importantly, we need to ensure that when our students leave us, they believe in learning. Even if they do not necessarily take our content with them, even if they still are not sure if they love this math component or this part of language arts, they need to leave being absolutely sure that learning has value. And it has value in getting you a good job, it has value in getting you to college, but more importantly, it has value because it is human. To be human is to learn. To be human is to ask questions. And to be human is to pursue those questions. And our students need to feel that, and they need to know that. And so with all of that said, I hope that if you take nothing else away from today, I hope that you take away the idea of a house called tomorrow. What is your idea of a house called tomorrow? What does that look like for your school, your classroom, your community? What is it? And once you've identified what that house called tomorrow may be, I would then ask that you take a second to consider what of these elements do you need in order to construct that house? How are you going to build up that engagement? Do they need more autonomy? Do they need more options to connect with other peers? What do they need? But it's critical to me that we always remember that we are the ones building that house. Whether we like it or not, we are the ones building the house. And so I'm going to ask you to be really intentional about the house that you are constructing. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you. If you want to look at any of the research that I've cited today, you can do so by scanning this QR code. I'll be here for a minute afterwards, so feel free to stick around and chat if you have any questions. But otherwise, I hope you've had a terrific conference, and I hope that you have another great session after this one. Thanks so much.